theater and the plague. The most terrible plague is the one that does not reveal its symptoms. From all this emerges the spiritual physiognomy of the disease, whose laws cannot be precisely defined, and whose geographical origin it would be idiotic to attempt to determine. For the Egyptian plague is not the Oriental plague, which is not that described by Hippocrates, which is not that of Syracuse, nor of Florence, nor the Black Death, which accounted for 50 million lives in medieval Europe. No one can say why the plague strikes the coward who flees it and spares the degenerate who gratifies himself on the corpses. Why distance, chastity, solitude are helpless against the attacks of the scourge. And why a group of debauchees isolating themselves in the country, like Boccaccio with his 2 well-stocked companions and 7 women as lustful as they were religious, can calmly wait for the warm days when the plague withdraws. And why in a nearby castle transformed into a citadel, with a cordon of armed men to forbid all entry, the plague turns the garrison and all the occupants into corpses, and spares only the armed men exposed to contagion. Who can also explain why the military cordon sanitaires, which Mendes Ali established toward the end of the last century on the occasion of an outbreak of the Egyptian plague, effectively protected convents, schools, prisons, and palaces, and why numerous epidemics of the plague, with all the characteristic symptoms of the Oriental plague, could suddenly break out in medieval Europe in places having no contact whatever with the Orient. From these peculiarities, these mysteries, these contradictions, and these symptoms, we must construct the spiritual physiognomy of a disease which progressively destroys the organism, like a pain which, as it intensifies and deepens, multiplies its resources and means of access at every level of the sensibility. Between the victim of the plague, who runs in shrieking pursuit of his visions, and the actor in pursuit of his feelings, between the man who invents for himself personages he could never have imagined without the plague, creating them in the midst of an audience of corpses and delirious lunatics, and the poet who inopportunely invents characters, entrusting them to a public equally inert or delirious. There are other analogies which confirm the only truths that count and locate the action of the theater, like that of the plague, on the level of a veritable epidemic. In the city of God, St. Augustine complains of this similarity between the action of the plague that kills without destroying the organs and the theater which, without killing, provokes the most mysterious alterations in the mind of not only an individual, but an entire populace. Extending this spiritual image of the plague, we can comprehend the troubled body fluids of the victim as the material aspect of a disorder which, in other contexts, is equivalent to the conflicts, struggles, cataclysms, and debacles our lives afford us. And just as it is not impossible that the unavailing despair of the lunatic screaming in an asylum can cause the plague by a sort of reversibility of feelings and images, one can similarly admit that the external events, political conflicts, natural cataclysms, the order of revolution and the disorder of war, by occurring in the context of the theater, discharge themselves into the sensibility of an audience with all the force of an epidemic. First of all, we must recognize that the theater, like the plague, is a delirium and is communicative. The mind believes what it sees and does what it believes. That is the secret of the fascination. For if the theater is like the plague, it is not only because it affects important collectivities and upsets them in an identical way. In the theater, as in the plague, there is something both victorious and vengeful. We are aware that the spontaneous conflagration which the plague lights wherever it passes is nothing else than an immense liquidation, a social disaster so far-reaching and an organic disorder. The plague takes images that are dormant, a latent disorder, and suddenly extends them into the most extreme gestures. The theater also takes gestures and pushes them as far as they will go. Like the plague, it reforges the chain between what is and what is not, between the virtuality of the possible and what already exists in materialized nature. It recovers the notion of symbols and archetypes which act like silent blows, rests, leaps of the heart, summons of the lymph, inflammatory images thrust into our abruptly wakened heads. The theater restores us as our dormant conflicts and all their powers, and gives these powers names we hail as symbols. And behold, before our eyes is fought a battle of symbols, one charging against another in an impossible melee. For there can be theater only from the moment when the impossible really begins, and when the poetry which occurs on the stage sustains and superheats the realized symbols. In the true theater, a play disturbs the senses' repose, frees the repressed unconscious, incites a kind of virtual revolt, which moreover can have its full effect only if it remains virtual, and imposes on the assembled collectivity an attitude that is both difficult and heroic. Like the plague, the theater is a formidable call to the forces that impel the mind by example to the source of its conflicts. If the essential theater is like the plague, it is not because it is contagious, but because, like the plague, it is the revelation, the bringing forth, the exteriorization of a depth of latent cruelty by means of which all the perverse possibilities of the mind, whether of an individual or a people, are localized. In the theater, as in the plague, there is a kind of strange sun, a light of an abnormal intensity by which it seems that the difficult and even the impossible suddenly become our normal element. The theater, like the plague, is in the image of this carnage and this essential separation. It releases conflicts, disengages powers, liberates possibilities, and if these possibilities and these powers are dark, it is the fault not of the plague nor of the theater, but of life. We do not see that life is as it is. We do not see that life as it is and as it has been fashioned for us provides many reasons for exultation. It appears that by means of the plague, a gigantic abscess, as much moral as social, has been collectively drained, and that, like the plague, the theater has been created to drain abscesses collectively. Perhaps the theater's poison, injected into the social body, disintegrates it, as St. Augustine says, but at least it does so as a plague, as an avenging scourge, a redeeming epidemic in which credulous ages have chosen to see the finger of God, and which is nothing but the application of a law of nature, whereby every gesture is counterbalanced by a gesture and every action by its reaction. The theater, like the plague, is a crisis which is resolved by death or cure. The plague is a superior disease because it is a total crisis after which nothing remains except death or an extreme purification. Similarly, the theater is a disease because it is the supreme equilibrium which cannot be achieved without destruction. It invites the mind to share a delirium which exalts its energies. And we can see, to conclude, that from the human point of view, the action of theater, like that of plague, is beneficial for impelling men to see themselves as they are. It causes the mask to fall, reveals the lie, the slackness, baseness, the hypocrisy of our world. It shakes off the asphyxiating inertia of matter which invades even the clearest testimony of the senses. And in revealing the collectivities of men, their dark power, their hidden force, it invites them to take in the face of destiny a superior and heroic attitude they would never have assumed without it. And the question we must now ask is whether, in this slippery world which is committing suicide without noticing it, there can be found a nucleus of men capable of imposing this superior notion of the theater. Men who will restore to all of us the natural and magic equivalent of the dogmas in which we no